Hello everyone. We will discuss Paul's Adam Christology in Romans 1 to 4. Romans 1 to 4. Romans. Paul is writing a letter to the church in Rome. Usually his letters are sent to the churches that he founded, but in this case, Romans, the church in Rome was not what Paul founded. So scholars were wondering when and how the church in Rome was founded. They suspect that at Pentecost, some believers, some people from Rome visited the church in Jerusalem, not the church in Jerusalem, but the temple in Jerusalem to celebrate the Pentecost. Obviously, they were either Jews or devout Gentiles, God-fearers. And after the Pentecost, they became Christians, so they came back to their hometown, Rome. Also, the church in Jerusalem, the gospel spread from Jerusalem to other cities in the Mediterranean world. Obviously, some Christians, Jewish Christians or Gentile Christians, moved to or visited city Rome. So originally, out of that, some gatherings of the believers in Rome, the church, the house church started in Rome. And then in Paul's time, so when the writing to the Romans was written around the end of 50s, 57 or 58, depending upon where Paul wrote this letter. So already about 30 years have passed after Jesus' death and resurrection. So in Rome, the church was there. So according to chapter 1, Paul says that his plan was to proclaim the gospel to the end of the world. At that time, the end of the world was in Spain from their perspective. They thought that the world is flat, right? So not round. So Spain was the end. So Paul wanted to go to Spain to proclaim the gospel. However, as is usual, Paul's system of proclamation of the gospel was that he will basically constitute a missionary team, and he and some of his brothers will visit a certain city, and at the same time he will get some help, financial and spiritual and prayer help from other churches in a different part of the world. So Paul expected the church in Rome to help him with this missionary activity in Spain. So Paul wanted to visit Rome soon to discuss this matter, but in the meantime, the people there do not know much about Paul. So although they probably heard about Paul, and many of the church leaders in Rome had some relationship or acknowledgement of Paul. So Paul, in his letter to the Romans, is writing some kind of, his thesis statement. His thesis statement about what his gospel is like. So in Romans, we scholars usually conjecture that the best or most developed form of Paul's gospel is found there. And the thesis, the major thesis of Paul's gospel is found in Romans 1, chapter 1, 16 to 17. Here Paul says, let me read Romans 1, 16 and 17. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for the salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed, from faith to faith, as it's written, but the righteous man shall live by faith. So basically, this is statement of the whole Romans, the gospel that Paul has been teaching. And in the first 4 chapters, Paul explains this term, chapter 1, 16 to 17, in more detail in chapter 1 through 4. And first of all, let me discuss. Okay, so chapter 1, 18 to 425, that's where Paul explains this thesis statement that is found in Romans 1, 16 to 17. However, 1:18 to 4:25 is consisted of two major portions in terms of how the way God's righteousness is expressed. Number one, God's righteousness is expressed as a wrath toward human sin, number one. Number two, God's wrath is expressed as salvation to humanity under God's wrath. So God's righteousness is expressed in two ways. Number one, since He is righteous, He has to express His wrath toward human sin, because God cannot, endure it. And at the same time, righteousness, that's more relational concept. The first concept is ethical, but the second concept, that's a relational concept. Since God is the creator of the whole universe, and God is the God of Israel, who is in a covenantal relationship with the Jews, God wanted to become their savior. In other words, God's righteousness in the second time should be expressed in His offering of salvation. And again, chapter 1, 18 to 3:20, that's about God's wrath toward the humanity's sin. However, in this first part, Paul divides this first part into two. Number one, God's righteous judgment toward Gentiles, and number two, Jews. So in chapter 1, 18 to 32, Paul is describing Gentiles' sin and God's judgment of their sin. And in part 2, chapter 2, 1 to 11, Paul explains God's wrath toward the Jews' sin and their condemnation. So Paul at the end in 2:12 to 3:20 will conclude that every humanity, either Jew or Gentile, they are all under God's wrath because they are all sin. So this is the first part of Paul's expression of God's righteousness toward humanity's sin. So Paul in the first two chapters, actually 3 chapters of Romans, Paul will say that nobody can be righteous in front of God because everybody is sinful. And in the second part, 3:21 to 4:25, Paul expresses that God wanted to become righteous in terms of making sinners righteous. So first, Paul will say, apart from the law, God's righteousness was given through Jesus' sacrificial death. So in other words, Jesus died for humanity by experiencing a sacrifice on the cross. So Jesus was offering Himself as a sacrifice for humanity's sin. So now God has a way of God can forgive humanity for their sin. And as a result, what is required is the faith. A human faith as a response to God's offering of the righteous salvation through His Son's sacrificial death. And that's found in 3:21 to 31. In chapter 4, basically, Paul will explain one good example of justification by faith, that is Abraham. So basically, God's righteousness, that can be understood in two ways. One is ethical, the other one is relational. And justification, therefore, means that you become righteous in front of God, and at the same time, you are restored to restore the relationship with God. It's a relational concept. So that's the idea of Romans 1, 16 to 4:25. So our question is, how is Adam Christology in the first 4 chapters of Romans found? Because it doesn't seem to be prominent that Adam Christology is there in the first 4 chapters of Romans. There are some evidences that we can glean from the first 4 chapters of Romans that Adam Christology is actually behind the Paul's discussion of God's righteousness in 2 ways, expressed in 2 ways in Romans 1 to 4. First, in Romans 1, first point, Romans 1, 18 to 32. Let's discuss how Paul's Adam Christology can be played out in this passage. 1, 16 to 17, Paul explained his gospel in terms of God's righteousness. And in the following, Paul explains humanity's sin and God's wrath and judgment as a creator toward the humanity, who is the created creature. First of all, Paul says that, interestingly enough, discussing humanity's sin, Paul says that God the Creator showed His nature and His eternal power and His divine nature through the created world, 1:19 to 20. However, the major sin of humanity is that they didn't worship God as their creator. And at the same time, they changed the immortal glory of God for the glory of mortal creatures. So as a result of not recognizing God as their creator and not worshiping Him as their Lord, God let them become idiot. So in 21, the human mind become corrupt, and some stupid ideas came into their minds in chapter 1:21. And at the same time, the second judgment from God regarding their idol worshiping is to let them live according to their own lusts. So humanity, because of letting loose by God, allowed to live according to their own lust, their life was filled with all sorts of sins. Obviously, in this passage, Paul is in conversation with a Jewish interlocutor. He's like a straw man, right? So Paul, in chapter 1, Paul seems to be engaged in conversation with the Jewish interlocutor. That's like a straw man. So obviously, Paul has a Jewish audience in his mind. And that Jewish audience will agree with Paul that, yes, Gentiles were sinning against God because they didn't accept God as their creator, while God revealed His divine nature and wisdom through the created world. So in this passage, in Paul's description of the Gentiles' sin in terms of idol worshiping, while they can have access to the knowledge of God, Paul is following a Jewish tradition in his time. For example, Josephus and Philo and Wisdom of Solomon 13 to 14, there are many Jewish writings there. However, especially the Jewish passage that Paul is especially quoting in chapter 1 of Romans is Wisdom of Solomon. There is a considerable parallels between wisdom and Romans regarding the sin of the Gentiles. I found like 7 of them, but they are written in Korean, so unfortunately you may not be read. So I will simply reiterate what I wrote. Number one, through creature, the knowledge of God was revealed to humanity. That's found in Romans 1, 19 to 21, and Wisdom of Solomon 13, 1 to 5. And number 2, humanity rejected worshiping God, and they fall into idol worshipping, which is unforgivable. That is found in Romans 1:21 and Wisdom of Solomon 13:6-9. Number 3, the beginning of their sin, humanity's sin, was idol worshipping. However, that idol worshipping sin was developed into ethical sin. So Romans 1:24-31 and Wisdom 14:12-14 and 27. And then the fourth one, one of the major ethical corruption was sexual. So against their nature, men and men, women and women, they were engaged in some sort of a sexual relationship that is found in Romans 1:26-27 and Wisdom 14:26. And number 5, corruption. Corruption is found in social relationship. In other words, not only individuals become corrupt, but also their relationship with one another became corrupt. You know that in the creation story, in the paradise, after the sin, Adam and Eve and God and humanity, their relationship were broken. So Romans 1:29-31 and Wisdom 14:23-27. And then 6 is God's judgment as an expression of God's judgment, humanity became more corrupt in terms of ethically and sexually. And then number 7, futility of their minds because of their sin. So Adam wanted to become wise, and he ate from the fruit of knowledge of good and bad. However, his mind became corrupt, and stupid ideas came into his mind, and then his mind was full of futility. And a similar idea is found in Romans 1:28 and Wisdom 11:15. So in Romans 1:21, Paul says that humanity, they were worshiping creatures, and they were changing the glory of immortal God into that of the mortal creatures. That's an expression, that's an evidence of the futility of their minds as a result of their sin. So, in Romans chapter 1, Paul is using a Jewish tradition to explain Gentile corruption and Gentile sin by using a Jewish tradition, and in which the major story, the major idea of their corruption, the major reason of their corruption was not worshiping God as their creator. And this is very interesting because somehow we can hear the story of Adam and Eve in a Gentiles' corruption story. Because in Genesis chapter 1-3, the knowledge of God was expressed through God's creature. And even through a relationship with God, Adam can have a clear idea of who God is. The knowledge of God was given to Adam. However, Adam decided not to worship God as his creature because of his lust for the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So Adam wanted to become like a God in terms of knowing good and evil. So somehow he was deceived by Satan, the snake, right? The serpent. At that very moment, Adam decided not to worship God, instead worship Satan, the serpent. He became disobedient to God by becoming obedient to Satan. In other words, he was engaged in idol worshiping, the serpent, rather than worshiping God. And as a result of that sin, Adam was set in the wrath of God, and Adam and Eve, their relationship was broken, and the humanity's relationship with God was broken. And after that, in Genesis chapter 6, sexual corruption come into existence. Angels from heaven come down to earth, and they got engaged in human daughters, and as a result, the whole world is filled with violence and sins and things like that in Genesis 7. So you know that because of that, God wanted to destroy the whole world completely in chapter 12, chapter 11, the Tower of Babel, and then the story of Noah, right? The whole story. So in Romans chapter 1, so all this, echoes, remembrance of Adam's story is kind of, echoing in Romans chapter 1. For example, Romans 1, 26 to 27 and 29, 31, the Greek word paredoken opens whole sorts of corruptions and the list of sins as a result of their idol worshipping. So in Romans chapter 1, idol worshipping comes first, and then ethical corruption next, and that's the exact order of what happened in Genesis 1 through 6. So in my mind, Genesis 1 to 3 plays a very important role in Romans chapter 1 as a kind of negative background. When Paul is describing humanities, especially Gentiles, corruption, not following their knowledge of God, but following their lust and become corrupt, and their mind becoming futile. Behind this, Adam's story, the fall of Adam plays a very negative role. It's like a background story. When you listen what Paul says in Romans 1, you suddenly kind of hear like a story of Adam there. So humanity followed Adam exactly in their disobedience to God and worshiping a creature, not accepting God as their creator, and then their social relationship become corrupt, and ethically they become corrupt, and things like that. So Adam's story is there as a background. Number two, in Romans 1, 22-23, Paul says that human beings, thinking that they are wise, their actually mind become stupid and futile. This is the first judgment of Paul toward humanity, actually Gentiles. But this is exactly the core of the fall of Adam and Eve. Adam wanted to eat fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Adam wanted to be like a God in terms of his knowledge, but because of that desire, his mind became futile, right? He became obedient to the serpent, the creature, rather than God, who created him. God said, "Do not eat from this tree. In that case, you will certainly die." He said that. However, serpent said, "No, you will not die. God is jealous. God doesn't want you to become like him." So Adam chose not to listen to God, but to serpent. So thinking that they are wise, their minds became futile, and that's what is found in Genesis 3:6, and that is what is found in Romans 1, 22-23. And number three, as a result of humanity's rejection of worshiping God as their creator, they changed the glory of the immortal God into the glory of animals. So, for example, and that image is found. The Greek word for image is eikon, and another similar word is homoioma. Eikon and homoioma, and these words are found in Genesis 1:26. Human beings were created in God's image. And Romans 1:26. And the term, the expression that Paul mentions here in Romans 26, like a mortal glory of human mortality, something like that. That is probably referring to Genesis 2:7, where human beings were made out of earth, dust. So we will all die eventually, and we will go experiencing mortality at death. So somehow there are resonances between Adam's story there and in Genesis 1-3 and Romans 1. So we can discuss that. And interestingly, in one of the Jewish writing called The Life of Adam and Eve, Eve is complaining against the serpent, saying, "Why did you make us become far off from God's glory? Why, you serpent, why did you make us lose our glory, that is God's glory?" And as a result of losing that glory, Eve acknowledges that he became a mere mortal humanity. So that idea is there. So it's a 26 minute. You know what? There are some more. So let's have a 10-minute break, and we will discuss some more similarities between Genesis 1-3 and Romans 1-3. Let's discuss that in 10 minutes.